Welcome back to Crime, Unearthed 911. In this third installment of the series, we'll be diving into the chilling stories of women who committed murder, ruthless killers who showed no mercy. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next intense and haunting case. Now, let's begin. Susan Diane Eubanks. On October 27th, 1997, in San Marcos, California, 33-year-old Susan Diane Eubanks committed an unforgivable act. She coldly shot each of her 4 children in the head. Brandon, 14 years old. Austin, 7 years old. Brigham, 6 years old. Matthew, 4 years old. None survived. After killing her children, Susan turned the gun on herself, but the bullet to her stomach did not end her life. She was arrested soon after. Those who knew Susan described her as a woman with a troubled past: alcoholism, toxic relationships, drowning in debt, and losing control of her emotions. On the night of the murders, she had a heated argument with her boyfriend and decided no one in her family should live anymore. On October 13th, 1999, Susan was sentenced to death for 4 counts of first-degree murder. However, due to a moratorium on the death penalty in California, her sentence was commuted to life without parole in 2024. Her children never had a chance to live, but she still does. Veronica Utilia Gonzalez. In 1995, in San Diego, California, 26-year-old Veronica Utilia Gonzalez and her husband committed one of the most horrifying crimes imaginable. The victim was 4-year-old Jenny Rose, Veronica's own niece. When Jenny's parents could no longer care for her due to legal issues and substance abuse, the little girl was sent to live with Veronica, hoping for a better life. Instead, Jenny endured horrific abuse. She was beaten, starved, hung by her arms from a closet hook, burned with a hairdryer. Her tiny body was covered in wounds, and the pain was so intense she could no longer even cry. On July 20th, 1998, Veronica was sentenced to death for first-degree murder with special circumstances of child torture. 27 years have passed, yet her sentence remains unfulfilled. Jenny never had the chance to live to 27. Socorro Susan Cairo. In November 1999, in California, 3 children were sound asleep believing they were safe in their own home. But the woman who gave birth to them, Socorro Susan Cairo, turned their home into a crime scene. Joey, 11 years old. Michael, 8 years old. Christopher, 5 years old. Susan shot and killed each of her children. The youngest, just 5 years old, had no chance to resist, no chance to escape. After murdering her children, Susan attempted suicide but failed. This woman was never diagnosed with a mental illness, yet her marriage was falling apart. Years of conflict with her husband drove her to the most vicious solution: murdering her children as an act of revenge. In 2002, Susan was sentenced to death for 3 counts of first-degree murder. 23 years have passed, yet she still awaits her final sentence. Brooke Marie Ratiez. On August 28, 2006, in Corona, California, 26-year-old Brooke Marie Ratiez, along with her accomplices, committed a brutal murder, all for the sake of robbery. 2 Latino men, aged 22 and 28, thought they were just going to have a fun night out. But in reality, they would never walk out of that hotel room alive. Brooke and her partners strangled the victims with their bare hands, choking them to death. All of this for a quick robbery. No remorse. No hesitation. On October 22nd, 2010, Brooke was sentenced to death for first-degree murder, with special circumstances of multiple murders during the commission of a robbery. 14 years have passed, yet the execution date has not been set. Kathy Lynn Saranana. On December 25th, 2005, what should have been a joyful Christmas day turned into a scene of deathly silence in the home of Kathy Lynn Saranana in Riverside, California. 2 young boys, Conrad Morales, 14 years old, and Ricky Morales, 11 years old, should have been loved and protected. Instead, they became the victims of a cruel aunt. They were starved, beaten until their small bodies were covered in bruises, tortured for months. That Christmas night, Ricky didn't survive. His body was hidden in a closet as if he was nothing more than discarded trash. A few months later, Conrad met the same fate. In 2009, Kathy was sentenced to death for the torture and murder of children. 15 years have passed. Yet her sentence still has not been carried out. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. In 1986, America was shocked by a series of brutal murders spanning from California to Arizona. The victims? Young women kidnapped, tortured, murdered mercilessly. And the mastermind behind it all? None other than Cynthia Lynn Kaufman, along with her accomplice and lover, James Gregory Marlowe. They began their crime spree with a familiar method approaching women, pretending to be friendly, then luring them into traps. But when the victims let their guard down, Kaufman and Marlowe revealed their true predator nature. These women were beaten, tied up, humiliated, and finally brutally killed. One of the most horrifying cases happened in October 1986, when they kidnapped and murdered Sandra Neri, a 32-year-old woman in Costa Mesa, California. She was strangled to death before her body was discarded in a remote area. And soon after, a series of similar murders followed. Kaufman was arrested in November 1986 and quickly confessed. But during the trial, she showed no remorse. Instead, she blamed Marlowe, claiming she was forced to participate. However, the evidence was stacked against her. In 1990, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman in California to receive such a sentence after the state reinstated the death penalty in 1977. Over 35 years have passed, yet her sentence has yet to be carried out. Carrie Lynn Dalton, San Diego, California, 1988. Carrie Lynn Dalton, along with her accomplices, planned and executed the gruesome murder of a woman named Irene Melanie May. And the reason? Dalton believed May had stolen her drugs. So she decided to take revenge in a way no one could have ever imagined. Irene May was kidnapped, held captive in a house, tortured for hours. Dalton and her partners beat her with hammers, knives, and iron rods. But that wasn't enough. They even poured battery acid on her during the savage assault. No one ever found May's body. But witnesses at the scene that day spoke up, providing enough evidence for police to charge Dalton. In 1995, Carrie Lynn Dalton was sentenced to death. Now 35 years later, her sentence still hasn't been carried out. Margaret Ann Allen. In 2005, in Titusville, Florida, 49-year-old Margaret Ann Allen committed one of the most brutal murders, all over a mere suspicion. She believed her housekeeper had stolen money from her. In a fit of rage, Allen beat the woman, forced her to drink bleach, and when the victim began convulsing in pain, Allen strangled her with a cord until she died. With the help of two accomplices, she disposed of the body in a remote area, trying to cover up her crime. But it didn't take long for police to track her down. A key witness came forward, revealing crucial details of the murder. When arrested, Allen showed no fear, no remorse. Instead, she denied everything. In 2011, Margaret Ann Allen was sentenced to death. 14 years have passed, yet her sentence remains unfulfilled. Kimberly Diane Cargill, Texas, 2010. Kimberly Diane Cargill had a dark secret she wanted to bury forever. But one woman knew the truth, and she had to be silenced. Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with intellectual disabilities, had been a babysitter for Cargill's children. But she was about to testify against Cargill in a custody battle. Cargill couldn't let that happen. On the night of June 18, 2010, she lured Cherry Walker to her home and murdered her by strangulation. Once she was certain the victim was dead, Cargill put her body in a car. She then poured gasoline over it and set it on fire, trying to destroy all evidence. But police quickly found Walker's remains. The evidence led straight back to Cargill. During the 2012 trial, she appeared calm, but she couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence against her. She was sentenced to death for first-degree murder. 14 years have passed, yet her execution date has not been set. Brittany Marlowe Holberg, Texas, 1996. An 80-year-old man, living alone, never imagined he would become the victim of a horrific crime. Brittany Marlowe Holberg, 23, a former drug addict and prostitute, met a B. Towery Sir through an acquaintance. She visited his home that fateful evening. What exactly happened between them remains unclear. But one thing is certain: Towery would never live to tell his story. Holberg stabbed him repeatedly with a knife, but she didn't stop there. She used a meat cleaver, scissors, other household tools, assaulting him over and over again. After the murder, Holberg calmly took a shower. She changed into clean clothes, then stole $1,400 from Towery's wallet and fled. She ran all the way to Tennessee, but police quickly tracked her down and arrested her. In 1998, Brittany Marlowe Holberg was sentenced to death for first-degree murder. 26 years have passed, yet her sentence remains unfulfilled. Tina LaSonia Brown. In 2010, in Pensacola, Florida, Tina LaSonia Brown, along with her daughter and neighbor, committed a crime so vicious it's almost unimaginable. They kidnapped, beat, and burned alive a 19-year-old girl, Audriana Zimmerman. But Audriana didn't die immediately. She was brutally beaten, tied up, placed in a car. Then they doused her with gasoline and set her on fire. Yet, somehow, Audriana survived long enough to attempt an escape. She fought to live, and before she died, she was able to identify her attackers. She never lived to see justice served, but her testimony helped police capture the killers. Before she succumbed to her injuries, Audriana named every one of them. In 2012, Tina LaSonia Brown was sentenced to death. Over 12 years have passed, yet the execution still hasn't taken place. Meanwhile, Audriana Zimmerman never got to see justice done. Robin Lee Rowe. In 1992, in Boise, Idaho, Robin Lee Rowe committed a brutal act, all to collect insurance money. After an argument with her husband, she set their house on fire, killing her husband and 2 young children in the blaze. But this wasn't the first time. Police quickly discovered that Robin had previously collected insurance payouts from a fire in 1980, a fire that killed her son under suspicious circumstances. As suspicions about the 1992 fire grew, investigators found damning evidence, leading to Robin's arrest. In 1993, she was sentenced to death for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Over 32 years have passed, yet Robin Lee Rowe still hasn't faced her sentence. Catherine Thompson, California. In 1990, Catherine Thompson, a wife and mother of 2, carefully plotted the murder of her husband, Melvin Thompson, in order to collect a $400,000 life insurance payout. Driven by greed and a desire to change her life, Catherine hired a hitman to carry out the crime. Plan was executed with cold precision, and Melvin was shot and killed at his auto repair shop. He died from a single bullet, unaware that his death was part of a ruthless conspiracy orchestrated by his own wife. The brutality of her crime was revealed in the 1993 trial, where the jury determined that Catherine had plotted the murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of California's most notorious cases of greed-fueled betrayal. 31 years later, Catherine Thompson still remains on death row, facing the consequences of an irreversible action. Each day on death row, she lives with the regret of a decision that cost her husband his life and tore her family apart. Manling Tsang, Williams, California. In 2007, Manling Tang Williams committed an act of unimaginable violence, overwhelmed by uncontrollable negative emotions. In a fit of rage, she murdered her husband with a samurai sword and then proceeded to suffocate her two young sons, showing no mercy, no remorse. Her actions shocked the community. This was a mother and a wife, yet she had brutally ended the lives of those closest to her. During her trial in 2010, Manling was sentenced to death. 14 years later, she still awaits the inevitable consequence of her violent outburst. Her crime forces society to confront the extreme consequences of losing control and the darkness within. The loss of her family is something she must live with, as the lives she destroyed can never be replaced. Maria del Rocio, California. In 1990, Maria del Rocio Alfaro committed a brutal crime when she broke into a friend's home with the intent to steal. But in an unforgivable act, Maria murdered 9-year-old Autumn Wallace by stabbing her 50 times. After killing the innocent child, Maria continued her crime spree by stealing belongings and selling them for drug money. Maria Alfaro became the first woman in Orange County's history to be sentenced to death for such a horrific crime. In 1992, she was convicted and sentenced to death. And 32 years later, she continues to face the consequences of her senseless and cruel act. Every day, she must live with the realization that she took the life of an innocent child driven by her greed and selfishness. Cherie Lash Rhodes, California. In 2014, Cherie Lash Rhodes carried out a brutal attack, killing 4 people at the office of the Cedarville Rancheria tribe. Her motive stemmed from accusations of embezzling tribe funds and a conflict over being expelled from the tribe. In a fit of rage and feeling betrayed, Cherie meticulously planned and executed a cold-blooded act of murder, showing no mercy for those she deemed responsible for her downfall. She shot and killed those she believed were involved in her expulsion, taking their lives in a ruthless attack. After the crime, Cherie was swiftly apprehended and brought to trial. In 2017, she was sentenced to death. Now, 7 years have passed since Cherie was sentenced, and she continues to face the consequences of her unforgivable actions, waiting on death row. She must live with the reality of the lives she took and the irreversible toll of her violent decisions. Skylar Preciosa de Leon, California. In 2004, Skylar Preciosa de Leon, a former child actor, lured the Hawks couple aboard a yacht with the intent to steal it. She forced the couple to sign a title transfer for the yacht, then callously threw them overboard, causing them to drown in the dark of night. Skylar's actions were motivated by greed, and her crime would cost her more than she ever anticipated. Sentenced to death in 2008, Skylar has spent 15 years on death row at San Quentin, where she awaits her final fate. This chilling crime serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked greed and the lengths to which some will go for financial gain, even at the expense of innocent lives. Tanya Jane Nelson, California. In 2005, Tanya Jane Nelson and her accomplice brutally murdered a fortune teller and his daughter in Westminster, California, after becoming enraged by the fortune teller's predictions. In an act of chilling coldness, the pair stabbed the victims to death and then painted their faces in an attempt to conceal their identities. Tanya was convicted of these murders and sentenced to death in 2010. 15 years later, she remains on death row, still facing the consequences of her ruthless act. This crime, born from a bruised ego and a moment of uncontrollable rage, left the victims dead and a community stunned, forcing everyone to reckon with the dangers of unaddressed anger. Jason Michael Han, California. Jason Michael Hand committed one of the most horrifying acts of domestic violence when he murdered his 2 young children within just 2 years. In a calculated and chilling move, he hid their bodies in storage units, trying to cover up the murders. The brutality of his actions left a lasting impact, as these innocent children were murdered by the one person who should have protected them. Jason was sentenced to death in 2013 and has spent 11 years on death row. His case serves as a horrific reminder of how extreme neglect and violence can emerge from within families, replacing love and protection with cruelty and death. The lives of these children, once full of promise, were stolen, and Jason must now live with the consequences of his unimaginable crime. Heather Leavell Keaton, Alabama. In 2010, Heather Leavell Keaton, in an unforgivable act of cruelty, poisoned and strangled her husband's 2 children. These innocent children had to endure the brutality of their own stepmother. Heather's actions not only took the lives of these children, but also shattered the family and the community, leaving lasting pain for the surviving family members. In 2015, Heather became the first woman to be sentenced to death in Mobile County. 10 years later, she still sits on death row. Her crime is a painful lesson in cruelty and a grim reminder of the responsibility lost in the role of a stepmother. Not only did she lose the ability to love, but she also destroyed the lives of innocent children. Lorraine Allison Hunter, California. In 2009, Lorraine Allison Hunter, along with her 16-year-old daughter, devised a plan to murder her husband in order to collect a $1 million life insurance payout. She meticulously planned the murder, making the crime even more complex and cruel. This is a prime example of how greed and selfish scheming can push someone to unimaginable acts of violence. In 2018, Lorraine Allison Hunter was sentenced to death. 6 years later, she still waits on death row, facing an unchangeable sentence. Her crime serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked greed, as a woman was willing to kill her own spouse for money. Belinda Maga, California. In 2009, Belinda Maga A. and her boyfriend committed an unbelievably cruel and terrifying act when they tortured and murdered her 2-year-old son. The marks on the child's body showed that not only was he beaten, but he also endured prolonged suffering before being killed in a brutal manner. This crime not only took a life, but also represented a horrific violation of a helpless child's right to live. Belinda Maga A. was sentenced to death in 2015 for the tortious act before murdering her son. 10 years later, she still faces the punishment for the brutal actions she carried out. This serves as a horrifying lesson on the cruelty that can come from those who are supposed to love and care for a child, turning into the very ones who destroy their innocent lives. Christy Michelle Scott, Alabama. Russellville, Alabama. On the night of August 16, 2008, a fire broke out in the small home of Christy Michelle Scott. When the flames were finally extinguished, firefighters discovered the body of Mason Scott, a 6-year-old boy trapped in the bedroom. The tragic sight left the entire town in shock, but investigators quickly determined this was no accident. Christy Scott had increased her son's life insurance policy by over $100,000 just before the fire. Her computer was filled with suspicious searches about house fire deaths. The day before the incident, she had purchased gasoline for no apparent reason. When questioned, she did not cry, nor was she shocked. She only asked about the insurance money. The trial took place in August 2009. The jury voted 7-5, recommending life imprisonment without parole. But the judge overrode the recommendation, sentencing her to death. Scott became the first woman sentenced to death in Alabama in over 50 years. Currently, after 15 years on death row, she still does not have an execution date. Patricia Blackmon, Alabama. On May 29, 1999, Patricia Blackmon called for an ambulance, saying her adopted daughter, Dominique Bryant, was not breathing. When medical personnel arrived, they found the 28-month-old girl lying motionless on the floor. But this was not a sudden death. An autopsy revealed that the child's skull was cracked, her ribs were broken, and there were bruises all over her body. On her chest, there was a deep shoe print, evidence of a violent stomp. Police arrested Blackmon on the same night. She had no reasonable explanation for what happened. In the 2002 trial, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. Blackmon almost showed no reaction when the sentence was delivered. Now, 22 years later, she still awaits execution. Tierra Capri Gobble, Alabama. Dothan, Alabama. On May 4, 2004, the cries of Phoenix Parrish, only 4 months old, echoed through the small apartment. But instead of comforting him, his mother, Tierra Capri Gobble, violently shook her baby. When emergency responders arrived, they found the child had stopped breathing. A large bruise on his head. His skull was fractured, a sign of severe trauma. The autopsy concluded that Phoenix Parrish died from blunt force trauma to the head. Police had no trouble identifying the perpetrator as the 25-year-old mother. In 2005, Gobble was sentenced to death after the jury voted 10-2. She did not cry, nor did she plead innocent. She remained silent. Now, 20 years later, she still sits behind bars, awaiting the inevitable conclusion to her fate. Lisa Leanne Graham, Alabama. Russell County, Alabama. In the summer of 2007, Lisa Leanne Graham needed to eliminate someone, her own daughter, 20-year-old Stephanie Shea Graham. But instead of doing it herself, she hired a hitman. Kenneth Walton, a family friend, was chosen. Lisa promised to pay him if he would take care of her daughter. On July 5, Walton lured Stephanie to a secluded area, claiming there was a job waiting for her. When she arrived, a gunshot rang out. Stephanie's body was found the next day. Police quickly arrested Walton, and from him, they traced the crime back to Lisa. In 2015, Graham was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman in Alabama to be sentenced to death for hiring someone to kill her own daughter. Now, nearly 10 years later, Lisa Graham still sits behind bars, showing no remorse. Wendy Elizabeth Andriano, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. On October 8, 2000, Joe Andriano, a terminal cancer patient, lay in his bed in his small apartment. The disease had drained the life from him, but what he didn't expect was that his death would not come from cancer, but from his own wife, Wendy Elizabeth Andriano. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Joe lying motionless, his head covered in blood, with a broken chair beside him. Initially, Wendy claimed that her husband had committed suicide, but the evidence on his body told a different story. An autopsy revealed that Joe had been poisoned with sodium azide, a highly toxic substance. But when the poison didn't kill him immediately, Wendy struck him repeatedly with the chair until he died. In the 2004 trial, Wendy claimed she had been abused by her husband, but witnesses confirmed this was a calculated murder plot. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Death penalty. Now, over 20 years later, Wendy remains on death row in Arizona. Shauna Ford, Arizona. Arivaca, Arizona. May 2009. Shauna Ford, a former member of a self-styled anti-immigration militia, led an attack on the home of Raul Flores, a man she believed was involved in drug trafficking. Her goal, to rob him for money to fund her group, Minutemen American Defense. Ford, along with her accomplices, Jason Bush and Albert Gaxiola broke into Flores' house, posing as law enforcement officers. But when Flores realized something was wrong, a barrage of gunfire rang out. He was shot dead on the spot. But the tragedy didn't end there. 9-year-old Brusimia Flores, his daughter, huddled next to her mother, trembling as she begged for her life. But Jason Bush, following Ford's orders, coldly pulled the trigger. Brusimia collapsed right there. Her mother, Gina Gonzalez, was shot but miraculously survived. Seriously injured, she managed to call the police and provide crucial testimony, helping authorities track down the perpetrators. In the 2011 trial, Shauna Ford was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few women sentenced to death in Arizona. Now, 14 years later, Ford still waits for her execution. Samantha Lucille Rebecca Allen, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. Summer 2011. Amy Deal, a 10-year-old girl, knelt in the corner of the room, sweat beading on her forehead. She had no idea that this would be her final night. The person who killed her was not a stranger, but Samantha Lucille Rebecca Allen, her cousin. Neighbors had heard Amy's cries for months. The girl had been tortured, starved, and forced to sleep outside as a form of punishment. But that night, the punishment turned into a brutal death sentence. Samantha and her husband, John Allen, forced Amy into a small plastic box, locked it, and left her inside in the stifling heat for hours. When they opened the box the next morning, Amy had suffocated to death. In the 2017 trial, the jury wasted no time in delivering the verdict. Death penalty. Now, 13 years later, Samantha Allen still waits for the day she must face the fate she created for herself. Michelle Lynn McCloud, California. Pleasanton, California. December 2, 1997. Vanessa Lee Sampson, 22 years old, was on her way home when a van suddenly pulled up beside her. Before she could react, she was dragged inside, her mouth covered, her hands and feet bound. The driver was James Anthony DeVeggio, and the woman sitting next to him, looking at her with a cold stare, was Michelle Lynn McCloud. For hours, Vanessa was tortured, raped, and abused in the van, which had been transformed into a mobile torture chamber. After satisfying their twisted desires, the murderous duo strangled her with a rope and discarded her body by the side of a snow-covered road. It took the police nearly a year to solve the case, but when they tracked down McCloud and DeVeggio, they discovered this wasn't the first time they had kidnapped and raped women. Vanessa was just their latest victim. In the 2002 trial, McCloud and DeVeggio were sentenced to death. She became one of the few women in California to be sentenced to death for a sexual crime. After 22 years on death row, McCloud still awaits her final fate. Valerie D. Martin, California. Lancaster, California. One night in June 2003, a fierce fire broke out from a car left on a deserted road. When firefighters extinguished the flames, they found the charred body of a man stuffed in the trunk of the car. The victim was identified as William Whiteside, 61, the boyfriend of Valerie D. Martin. But what was even more horrifying was that he didn't die from the fire. He had been beaten and tortured before being locked in the trunk and set on fire. The investigation revealed a cold-blooded plot. Martin, along with her 16-year-old son and 2 other accomplices, had brutally attacked Whiteside, then set his body on fire to cover up the crime. The motive appeared to involve money and personal conflicts. In the 2010 trial, the jury unanimously sentenced her to death. Now, 15 years later, Valerie Martin still awaits the day she must pay for her crime. Maureen McDermott, California. Van Nuys, California. In 1985, Maureen McDermott, a nurse, instead of saving lives, planned to kill her roommate to collect his life insurance money. The victim was Stephen Eldridge, a kind man who had no idea that death was waiting for him. One night, McDermott hired a hitman, Jimmy Luna, and instructed him to kill Eldridge. That night, Luna ambushed Eldridge in the apartment. When Eldridge entered, he was stabbed 44 times, ensuring he had no chance of survival. Eldridge's body was mutilated to mislead police into believing the murder was sexually motivated. However, it didn't take long for the police to uncover the truth. McDermott was arrested, and when the insurance motive was revealed, she quickly became the center of the trial. In 1990, the jury sentenced her to death, making McDermott the first woman in California to be sentenced to death in decades. Now, after more than 34 years on death row, Maureen McDermott still waits for execution, becoming one of the longest-serving female death row inmates in California. We've just explored some truly chilling stories of women who committed horrific crimes against their own loved ones. Their rash decisions not only took the lives of their victims, but also sentenced themselves to irreversible fates. The lesson here is clear. Whether male or female, we must always be aware of the power of our emotions and the consequences of our actions. Impulsive decisions only lead to regret and pain. If you want to continue following these haunting and dramatic stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn a notification bell. Thank you for watching.